anorexia. So I know you've looked into this. There is variation in how much in incidences of anorexia that we see cross-culturally, and indeed all sorts of other indications of mental distress that we see cross-culturally. The stereotype of the anorexic is the golden girl. I've read that anorexics have like quite significantly higher IQs than the average population. The population we're talking about is often very, well, they have to have a very high level of self-control. What do you think's going on with that?
I studied eating disordered behavior in a couple different ways over quite a big span of time. So I did some work almost 20, actually it was 20 years ago. And then I did some work just, maybe 5 or 6 years ago that I published that was looking at this. Originally a lot of what I was focused on was what kinds of stressors might make this more or less problematic. The things that we found to be most problematic were mainly things surrounding female competition, right? High levels of female competition. It didn't really matter what the female competition was about. I mean, a lot of it was about looks and status and boyfriends and whatever. It's just high levels of teenage girl kind of competition. And we actually did look at some of the things like the media effects at that time. Now, that was pre the rise of the current sort of level of things with Instagram and Snapchat and things like that. And we didn't find a big effect for that. But we did find a really big effect for people's self-perception of how much competition that was happening between girls, which kind of explains the early data showing really high levels of eating disorders in like girls' boarding schools and things like that, where there aren't even any guys around, but the girls are all competing with each other within their own social group. And so from an evolutionary perspective, we were looking at it like very much as a female intersexual competition thing, and this idea that it suppresses reproduction, right? And if you can suppress other women's reproduction and make them less attractive to the opposite sex, that might be a very effective tactic in terms of the way women respond to other, women, in terms of engaging in behaviors that may be damaging to individuals in terms of their fertility.
Wait, sorry. So it would be in my evolutionary interests to encourage my female competitor to become anorexic, because then she would stop.
Yeah, that could be part of it, right? That could be part of it. And part of it could be the sort of more traditional perspective of looking at it, which is just, if it's not a good time to reproduce, you should suppress your reproduction, right? Which is the sort of animal model that a lot of people have also looked at in terms of eating disorder behavior, which is, it ties in a lot to the physiology, right? If your body fat drops too low, then reproduction ceases. And in times of famine, that would have been a useful strategy. I don't, the fact that it happens so often and more often in highly developed countries and societies where we have an over access to food suggests that it's not so much about that aspect of things. It's about other social factors that are making your reproductive competition and your reproductive activities perhaps undesirable. And some of it may be competition between women where women are actively suppressing other women by their actions, or it may be just that the women themselves are perceiving the environment as being less positive and so are, engaging in this behavior that then suppresses it. A lot of the work that we did was just looking at what kinds of factors might influence that kind of thing, and then how are those things playing out in the modern environment. And I think that sort of speaks to some of the differences cross-culturally, right? Where women are expected to actually not really be focusing a lot on reproduction in terms of baby making, but are supposed to be taking on a very masculine role, then reproduction is not necessarily a positive thing. And so women might self-suppress under those environmental conditions.
Oh, that's interesting. So anorexia might be more of a feature in a sort of low fertility society, which is more focused on female masculine achievement.
Or at least taking on a more masculine typical role societally, right? So that the majority of work is outside the home in more traditionally masculine environment rather than working from home, taking care of kids, things like that, right? If you look at like those differences between traditional and non-traditional societies, you see these big differences in disordered eating behavior amongst high achieving women, which might speak to your IQ issue. I have not actually ever measured that in any of the studies that I've done looking at eating disordered behavior, but it might make sense that those women may be pursuing those strategies in the modern environment And that may be increasing that challenge for them, right?
I know you said that media didn't seem to make that big a difference in your studies, which was pre-social media. But it is socially contagious, right? I mean, that's the impression I get, that
Yeah,
it
I
has a
mean,
kind of mimetic energy.
yeah, I think it's interesting to think about that. There's actually and it's not looking at eating disorder behavior. I think it's looking at social media more broadly. So a recent meta-analysis is just in the process of coming out. I think it was just accepted by, I think, Chris Ferguson, looking at the effects of social media and showing that they're not as strong as we necessarily think they are. I do think that peer stuff, period, is always an issue, right? Because when we think about the idea that if this is about competition between women, then the women in your own environment are the ones who are going to be influencing you. Now, for most of our history, that would have been the girls in our social group, right? Like the girls in the gang. It'll be the girls in the social group. I think the relevance of social media may be in how susceptible people are to internalizing that social media as part of their social group, right? And again, that's the argument for why it should matter. I'm not sure that the data is as clear cut that it does as we often assume it should be, but I think the possibility is there that it could be. I mean, people learn information from the environment around them, right? If they're taking it in from that environment as well as their local environment, I think that um, says that it probably is having some sort of effect. Whether it's the majority effect moving it, I don't know, because we had problems with this long before social media as well.
So you sometimes read about cases historically of so-called holy anorexics, so women who manifest anorexia-like symptoms, I suppose, but say in medieval Europe, and they do it for their justification for it is religious and to do with fasting rather than rather than more contemporary understandings of it. Do you think it's the same phenomenon that we're seeing, just sort of expressed in different cultural contexts, or do you think there's reason to believe that those holy anorexics have nothing to do with modern anorexics?
Yeah, I think it's really hard to know, right? I mean, I think it's really hard to know. For me, I want to know a lot more detail about their own personal sort of history in every single one of those case studies, because the question is like, if they're doing it for religious reasons, are they somebody who's already sacrificed their reproductive existence to that? Is it something that brings them status within their community, right? I mean, and presumably that sort of thing can, and so could have that kind of an effect. One of the things about this, though, too, that I wanted to address, because I think you mentioned at the very beginning, was this issue about self-control. So one of the more recent studies that I did in collaboration with AJ Figueiredo and one of his students, we actually measured executive function, which is supposed to be a measure of that. And it was actually lower in people that had more disordered eating behavior. And so again, it was like, well, I mean, you clearly have to have enough self-control to not eat, but you also are not self-controlled enough to eat properly. See what I mean? Like it's like an exaggeration. So people who have to take it to the extreme, either I'm going to eat very little or I'm going to eat very much. It's still a failure of proper regulation, I guess, in a sense. And so I think it's an interesting question about what's really going on with their ability to exercise appropriate levels of control over their behavior.
I've heard some people who've had eating disorders say that being very, very hungry sometimes has a kind of psychological high or physiological high. Actually, it can be actually quite addictive, that feeling of extreme hunger.
Like a runner's high?
I mean, yeah, I guess so. I mean, and it made me wonder if some people are more that's a experience that's found in some people and not others, and they might be more susceptible, therefore, to getting sort of addicted to it.
Yeah, there probably are a bunch of different factors that increase things like susceptibility to that. And, the interesting thing would be to look at that and see if you could figure out what makes somebody's susceptibility, what would make somebody more likely to experience that, to experience a runner's high, the excessive exercising sort of reaction, whether it ties into susceptibility to other kinds of things like drug or alcohol use, right? Because then it might tell you something more about what we should be attending to when we're concerned about the behaviors, right? So in the stuff that I did back when I like 20 years ago, we were looking at susceptibility measures, right? And so we were particularly interested because there was a huge difference, like in terms of how likely women were to have disordered thoughts about their eating, even if they had the same kinds of exposure to things that we would consider to be risk factors, like high perceptions of female competition, the sort of high levels to media imagery or whatever, high levels of stress in other areas of their lives. And one of the things that seemed to be somewhat protective was high levels of social support. So now we weren't actually, we're measuring their perceptions of social support, right? So we don't really know about the social support. But when they feel like they have a lot of social support, whether it's from parents, lovers, or friends, that seems to serve some sort of protective effect against them actually engaging in behaviors that are disordered, whether their thinking about it is a little bit disordered or not. And so from an intervention standpoint, I think that's probably one of the ways that we could try and tackle some of these problems better. Because even so, say it is female competition, right? How do you remove that? Like, it's part of our lives, right? It's like you can't wave a wand and take kids out of their 2,000 student high school where they're competing with other people all the time, right? We don't live in the ancestral environment. We live in the modern world. And so what things can we change? And some of it might be the way people think about their social support, and to try and encourage, closer social ties to people in a way that might be protective.